The rescue ships saw it first, a gray ghost on the horizon. Where a vibrant city once stood, there was only silence. Saint-Pierre was gone, erased, buried under a thick blanket of hot ash. As sailors stepped ashore, the heat was still intense enough to burn their boots. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and death. They found a city frozen in time. A population of 30,000 people turned into statues. In the ruins of a cafe, patrons were still sitting at their tables, cups raised, now just charcoal figures. A mother was found shielding her child, their embrace locked forever in stone. A clock on a government building was melted, its hands stopped at 7:52 a.m., the exact moment of death for an entire civilization. This was the Paris of the Caribbean, a jewel of trade and culture. Now it was a tomb. But this wasn't a surprise attack. The mountain, Mount Pelée, had been screaming for a month. It started with tremors, gentle at first, then violent enough to crack walls. Then came the ash. Not a light dusting, but a suffocating gray snow that piled up in the streets, collapsing roofs and turning day into a gloomy twilight. The water in the harbor began to boil. The air became toxic, a rotten egg stench of sulfur that made people choke. And then the animals came. A river of giant centipedes and venomous pit vipers, driven from the mountain by the heat, swarmed the city streets. They invaded homes. People woke up to snakes in their beds. Dozens died from bites. The mountain was giving its final warning. It was telling them to run. So why did no one leave? Why did 30,000 people stay and wait for their own execution? The answer is simple. They were told to. The governor, Louis Moutet, was worried about an upcoming election. And evacuation would mean canceling the vote. It would mean panic. It would mean losing control. So he blocked the roads. He posted soldiers to turn people back. He told the newspapers to print reassuring headlines. "The mountain is calm," they said. "There is no danger." He assembled a commission of scientists. They stood on the edge of the city, looked at the smoking peak, and declared Saint-Pierre the safest place on the island. They were lying. Everyone in power was lying. The people could smell the poison in the air. They could see the ash piling up like snowdrifts. They could hear the mountain rumbling, a deep, angry growl that never stopped. Yet they stayed. They trusted their leaders over their own senses. This story isn't just about a volcano. It's about a lie. A lie so powerful it held an entire city hostage until it was too late. The evidence of the coming disaster was overwhelming, yet it was ignored. This case is a chilling reminder of how easily truth can be buried, even when a volcano is about to erupt. To help us uncover more of history's darkest secrets, subscribe to the channel right now. Now, to truly understand the scale of this betrayal, we must go back to the first fatal decision, the one that sealed the city's fate weeks before the final fiery explosion. The first fatal decision wasn't made by a scientist, it was made by a politician. Governor Louis Moutet arrived in Saint-Pierre not with rescue plans, but with a political agenda. An election was just days away. A radical party, a group he saw as a threat to French colonial order, was gaining ground. And Saint-Pierre was his fortress, a critical stronghold of loyal voters. If the city evacuated, the election would be postponed, maybe canceled. His opponents would claim he lost control. His career in Paris would be over. The volcano, in his mind, was not a geological threat. It was a political opponent. And he intended to defeat it with force and deception. His first move was a piece of cold, calculated theater. He moved his wife, Madame Moutet, into a grand residence in the heart of Saint-Pierre. They hosted lavish parties on open-air verandas. While a fine gray ash settled on the champagne flutes, they smiled for photographers. The message was broadcast to every corner of the island. If it's safe enough for the governor's wife, it's safe enough for your family. It was a brilliant, cynical performance. The city's elite, desperate for reassurance, played their part. They toasted to the city's resilience, their laughter echoing over the deep, guttural rumbles from the mountain. They were performing their own safety, a desperate dance on the edge of a grave. Behind the smiles, Moutet was building a prison. He dispatched soldiers to every road leading out of the city. Their orders were simple and brutal. Turn everyone back. No exceptions. Imagine a family, their cart loaded with their few precious belongings, trying to flee. They reach the checkpoint. A father pleads with a young soldier, pointing to the sky, to the ash choking his children. The soldier, stone-faced, simply shakes his head. The governor's orders. The roads are closed. Return to your homes. Spreading panic is a crime. The family is forced to turn their cart around, heading back into the suffocating city. They were not citizens seeking safety. They were prisoners of a political campaign. The newspapers became his most powerful weapon. Moutet summoned the editors of the local papers, like Les Colonies. He didn't ask for their cooperation. He demanded it. Any editor who dared to print the truth about the swarms of snakes, the boiling harbor, or the suffocating ash would be arrested for inciting panic. So they printed the lies. Mount Pelée poses no threat. Saint-Pierre safer than ever. Governor Moutet assures calm. Citizens would read these headlines, the black ink on the page stark against the gray ash that covered their hands. It was a form of madness. Your eyes and lungs told you that you were in mortal danger, but the official voice of society told you that you were crazy. To cement the lie, Moutet assembled a scientific commission. It was a sham. The men he chose were not independent volcanologists. They were loyalists and academics who depended on his favor. He took them to a viewpoint overlooking the city, the angry plume of smoke from Pelée filling the sky. He didn't ask for their analysis. He told them their conclusion. That afternoon, the commission stood before the public and declared that the volcano's activity was normal. They stated that the city of Saint-Pierre was the safest place on the entire island. It was the final nail in the coffin. The lie was now official. It had the stamp of science. The psychological pressure became unbearable. The city turned on itself. Those who tried to leave were branded cowards. Neighbors reported neighbors for spreading fear. Arguments broke out in every home. A husband would show his wife the newspaper, demanding she trust the governor. The wife would point to the dead birds fallen from the sky, their lungs clogged with ash. They were trapped not just by soldiers, but by a web of official lies so thick it was impossible to see the truth. They were told to stay put, to trust the experts. And with the population successfully pinned down, the mountain prepared to end the debate. The warnings were no longer subtle. A wall of boiling mud and water, a lahar, suddenly broke from the volcano's flank. It roared down the riverbed at 100 miles an hour, swallowing a sugar mill whole, burying 40 workers alive. The evidence was now undeniable. A piece of the mountain had just liquidated a factory. But the lie was too big to retract. Admitting the truth now would be admitting to murder, so they doubled down. And the final terrible explosion was now just hours away. The final night in Saint-Pierre was not dark. The sky glowed a sickening, angry red, as if the sun had set and caught fire beneath the horizon. The peak of Mount Pelée was no longer just smoking. It was a wound in the fabric of the world, pulsing with an infernal light. The rumbling was no longer a distant threat felt through the soles of their feet. It was inside their bones, a deep, continuous vibration that shook their teeth and made sleep impossible. People lay awake in their beds, listening to the house tremble, feeling the monster next door breathing. Ash fell thicker than ever. It wasn't dust anymore. It was grit, a coarse gray sand that got into everything. It was in their food, a crunch of glass in every bite of bread. It was in their water, turning it into a cloudy, sulfurous sludge. Every breath was a struggle, a painful scrape of volcanic particles against raw tissue. The city was choking to death, slowly, and the soldiers on the roads were the hands around its throat. But the lie held. The barricades remained. The newspapers, delivered that final morning by boys with ash-caked faces, still promised safety. The headline in Les Colonies on May 8th, the day of the eruption, was a masterpiece of deadly propaganda. Where could one be better off than in Saint-Pierre? It was Ascension Day, a holy festival. The governor had insisted on it, a citywide celebration to prove his point, to prove that life was normal. So the people played their parts, like actors in a horror play. They swept the heavy ash from their doorsteps, creating small, clean squares in a world of gray. They put on their finest clothes, crisp white suits and starched dresses for church. They walked through the suffocating streets, a ghostly procession moving towards the cathedral. The contrast was terrifying. Their clean, bright clothes against a landscape that looked like a photograph of hell. The bells of the great church began to toll, their sound muffled and dead in the thick, heavy air. It didn't sound like a call to worship. It sounded like a funeral dirge. They were trying to pretend it was just another holiday, but they could see the truth with their own eyes. The harbor was a graveyard of ships, many capsized by the violent boiling water, their masts sticking out of the steaming sea like crosses. The once lush trees were skeletal, their leaves burned away by acid rain, and the mountain loomed over them, a monster that had finally stopped growling and was now taking a deep, final breath before the kill. Inside the cathedral, hundreds gathered. They knelt on pews coated in a fine layer of ash. They tried to pray, but their voices were drowned out by the incessant roar from outside. Governor Montet and his wife were there, sitting in the front row, a final, arrogant act of political theater. They were smiling, projecting a calm they could not possibly feel. At 7:50 a.m., the telegraph operator at the central office, a man named Auguste Siparis, sent his last message. It was frantic, uncoded, a desperate burst of pure terror. Allez, Pelée, eruption, terrible. And then the line went dead. Silence. At 7:52 a.m., the world broke. 4 explosions boomed from the summit. Not a rumble, but a sharp, deafening crack. The sound of the planet's crust snapping in half. Witnesses on ships far out at sea said it was like a cannon shot that shook the ocean itself. A sound so violent it felt like a physical blow. The entire side of the mountain facing Saint-Pierre tore open. It didn't erupt upwards towards the sky. It erupted sideways. A superheated cloud of gas, ash, and pulverized rock, glowing black and red, burst out of the wound. It was a solid wall of fire, moving at over 300 miles per hour, faster than any hurricane, hotter than a crematorium. It wasn't flowing down the mountain like lava. It was an avalanche from the sky, a pyroclastic flow that hugged the ground, instantly incinerating every single thing in its path. For the 30,000 people trapped in Saint-Pierre, there was no time to scream. There was no time to run. The cloud hit the city in less than 2 minutes. First came the pressure wave, an invisible fist that shattered every window and blew doors off their hinges. Then came the roar, a sound that was no longer a sound, but a physical force that ruptured eardrums. And then came the heat. The air itself became fire. It turned lungs to ash from the inside out. It vaporized flesh from bone. In the cathedral, the prayer stopped mid-sentence. In the streets, the ghostly procession vanished. The world went from gray to black in a single blinding flash of light. The city did not burn. It detonated. The pyroclastic cloud, a dense mass of superheated gas and rock, struck the city not as a wave, but as a solid object moving at the speed of sound. Stone buildings didn't crumble. They exploded outwards, pulverized into fine dust by a pressure wave so intense it turned glass to sand before the sound of the blast even arrived. Iron railings on balconies didn't just bend, they melted and dripped like hot wax. The thousands of rum barrels lining the waterfront warehouses became a city-wide bomb. The first one went, then 10, then 100, exploding in a deafening chain reaction. This unleashed a river of blue fire, 1,000 degrees hot, that coursed through the ruined streets. It wasn't like water, it was a thick, glowing liquid that climbed the walls of shattered buildings, incinerating the bodies of those who had died just a second before. The great bell of the cathedral, which had been tolling for the Ascension Day service, melted in mid-swing. The sound of its final toll was consumed by a roar that was not a sound, but the physical feeling of the world being torn apart. Inside, Governor Moutet, his wife, and the city's elite were erased. His final act of political theater met the ultimate reality. There was no negotiation. There was no escape. The mountain had passed its sentence. But in the heart of this furnace, a man was locked in a box. Auguste Siparis, imprisoned the night before for a drunken brawl, was in the jail's dungeon. It was a stone cube, partially underground, with no windows, only a small grate in the door. He heard the 4 explosions. Then the world outside his cell turned into a physical force. An impossible heat blasted through the grate, a focused beam of fire that seared his back, his arms, his face. The air in his cell became a weapon. He screamed, dropping to the floor, pressing his face against the cool stone, trying to breathe air that wasn't fire. He held his shirt over his mouth, but the fabric was scorching hot, burning his hands. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own blood pounding in his ears. And then, as quickly as it began, the roaring stopped. He was in total darkness, total silence. Cooked alive, but alive. On the city's edge, a shoemaker named Leon Compere Leandra was on his doorstep. He saw the cloud coming. He described it as a boiling wall that filled the entire sky, a living thing of black and red. He didn't think, he just ran. The heat hit him from behind, a physical blow that threw him dozens of feet through the air. His clothes were burned from his body in an instant. He landed in a heap, his skin covered in horrific burns, but he was breathing. All around him, everyone he had ever known was gone. In the harbor, the steamship Roraima was engulfed. Captain Mugga saw the mountain split open. He screamed at his crew, "Cut the anchor, full reverse!" It was useless. The firestorm slammed into the ship, snapping the thick steel masts like twigs and setting the wooden deck ablaze instantly. The air filled with burning ash, so thick it was like breathing sand and fire. Men caught fire where they stood, their screams cut short as their lungs filled with incandescent gas. They leaped into the harbor, a desperate final act, only to find the water was boiling. Of the 50 souls on board, only 2 would survive the initial blast, shielded by a steel bulkhead in the ship's engine room. They watched in horror through a small porthole as their ship became a floating pyre in a sea of fire and death. The explosion itself lasted less than 3 minutes. The cloud passed over the city and out to sea, its energy spent. It left behind a landscape from another planet. A smoking, flattened ruin under a sky turned permanently black. Every street was gone. Every building was a pile of superheated rubble glowing a dull red in the darkness. 30,000 people were dead. The city of Saint-Pierre had been surgically removed from the face of the earth. But the eruption wasn't over. The mountain was just getting started. For 3 days, the ruins of Saint-Pierre cooked under a black sky. It was a permanent twilight, choked with a thick, gritty ash that blotted out the sun. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was an unnatural void, a complete absence of the 30,000 voices that had filled the city just hours before. The only sounds were the hiss of superheated rock cooling in the sea and the deep, guttural groans from the mountain's core. Mount Pelée wasn't finished. It was breathing. On May 20th, 12 days after the main event, the mountain erupted again. Another pyroclastic flow, a near-perfect echo of the first, roared down the same path. It scoured the rubble, incinerated the dead a second time, and buried the city under another thick layer of ash. It was a final, brutal act of erasure, as if the volcano wanted to make sure its work was complete, leaving no trace of the civilization it had annihilated. Rescue ships from Fort de France circled the coast like vultures. Sailors watched from the decks, their faces wrapped in cloth against the toxic air. They saw a gray, flattened wasteland where a vibrant city once stood. The heat radiating from the shore was so intense it could be felt hundreds of yards out at sea. When the first rescue teams finally attempted to land, their boots sank into hot, soft ash. The air was a poisonous soup of sulfur, chlorine, and fine glass particles that tore at their lungs. They walked through a nightmare landscape. They found a city frozen in its last second of life. A postman, his mailbag still slung over his shoulder, was now a charcoal statue leaning against a wall. A family was found sitting around a dining table, their meal uneaten, their forms perfectly preserved in ash. The melted clock on the military hospital was stopped at 7:52 a.m., a permanent monument to the exact moment of death. They heard no screams. They saw no movement. They concluded with grim certainty that there were no survivors. But deep within the ruins, a man was screaming. Auguste Saparas lay in his stone box, horribly burned, trapped in absolute darkness. The initial blast had felt like the world ending. A wave of impossible heat had shot through the small grate in his door, searing his back, arms, and face. For 4 days he was alone in a dead city, a living man buried in his own tomb. The thirst was a torment. He licked the condensation from the cool stone walls, a few precious drops to keep him alive. He shouted until his throat was a raw, bleeding wound, but the only answer was the rumbling of the earth beneath him. He was losing his mind, hearing phantom voices in the suffocating silence. He had given up hope. And then, on the 4th day, he heard something else. Shouting, real voices. A rescue team, drawn by the faintest of cries, had stumbled upon the ruins of the jail. They followed the sound, digging through hot debris until they found the grate to his cell. They pried it open, and light flooded the tomb. They found a man, barely human, his body a canvas of horrific burns, but alive. Auguste Saparas, the drunken brawler, had survived the apocalypse because he had been locked in a cage. He wasn't the only one. On the city's edge, Leon Comper-Leandre, the shoemaker, stumbled through the ruins, a ghost in a dead world. He was delirious with pain, his skin shredded, but he was moving. He walked through streets that were now glowing canyons of rubble, stepping over the carbonized forms of his neighbors. He saw no one else. He was utterly alone until he collapsed and was found by a patrol. A young girl, Havivra Diafril, was discovered days later, floating in a small boat far out at sea, having been blown clear of the city by the sheer force of the blast. But out of 30,000 people trapped by a governor's lie, the number of confirmed survivors from within the city's main blast zone was just 2. The city of Saint-Pierre was never rebuilt. It was left as it was, a memorial to a catastrophe born from both geological fury and human arrogance. The ruins are still there today, a modern Pompeii, a permanent scar on the island. The volcano erased the city, but the decisions made by men in power ensured there was no one left to escape. The story of Saint-Pierre is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous force of nature is the one that tells you not to run. Who do you believe was the true villain here?
the unstoppable force of Mount Pelée, or the governor who chained his people to the foot of the volcano for political gain? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. And if you want to explore more cases where human error led to ultimate disaster, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation.